studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Monday, April 13th, 2015. On today's show, we'll feature a one-hour special on oppression, incarceration, and economic injustice in the Black community. Melina Abdulla of the Black Lives Matter movement joins Loretta Stevens of the Black Worker Center to make the links. And author Alice Goffman discusses her new book, On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, two new studies released this morning underscore the dire situation of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, siege, and war. Human Rights Watch detailed the extent of Palestinian child labor inside Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Hundreds of children, some as young as 11, are employed on settlements for low pay with harsh working conditions. And the Association of International Development Agencies also released a report showing that just a quarter of all the funds pledged to rebuild Gaza after last summer's brutal Israeli war have actually come through. Dozens of aid groups which signed on to the report urged the lifting of Israel's economic and military siege of Gaza, saying it was the only way that the region could be rebuilt properly. Well, Rahul, both Gaza and the West Bank, despite differences in their conditions, seem to be suffering terribly under Israeli policy, but Israel has rarely cared about such reports, has it?
Well, no, I mean, this is now, these two reports can be added onto untold scores or hundreds of reports of especially the last 15 or 20 years. So basically every international human rights organization, UN agency, and so on has gotten in on this particular enterprise at some point. And at no point does it seem like the Israeli government has actually tried to do very much specifically in response to questions of human rights violations. And I think the last incredibly wide-ranging and brutal assault on Gaza with over 2,000 people killed, 20,000 homes destroyed, and over 100,000 damaged shows pretty clearly how much they're going to be deterred by any thought of international talk about the human rights of the Palestinians.
And more than 250,000 people marched in the Brazilian metropolis of Sao Paulo on Sunday, as well as part of an ongoing wave of protests against President Dilma Rousseff. Protests took place in other parts of Brazil too, but were smaller than earlier gatherings in March. The president, who has an approval rating of only 13%, is being accused by opposition forces of understating the health of the nation's economy, as well as being embroiled in a corruption scandal. The New York Times reported that, quote, fringe demonstrators called for a constitutional military intervention, which would apparently involve a junta taking power before calling for new presidential elections. Brazil's 1964 coup resulted in a devastating military dictatorship that lasted decades. Rahul, how serious do you think these protests are for President Rousseff? Do they represent a real threat to her presidency?
Well, first of all, I would really discount any talk about the military or military intervention. I mean, the great story of South America in particular in the last couple of decades is the total discrediting of the military as a political force. Brazil is maybe not the country in which that discrediting has been most extreme, but I wouldn't take it seriously at all. But overall, yes, Dilma, anytime that your approval rating has gone as low as 13%, over 60% of people in some polls are calling for your impeachment. You have a major, constantly ramifying corruption scandal that reaches into your inner circle, although it hasn't yet touched Dilma herself. All of this is indication, and of course major protests, all of this is indication that in fact her administration is potentially in a lot of trouble. I think we'd have to see another level of escalation before I'd say that it's likely. Right now, it seems as if most likely if she fires the right people, hunkers down, and waits for the economy to improve, because economic stagnation is also playing a part in this, she'll probably weather it. But at this point, it's worth taking seriously.
Perhaps Rousseff can share some advice with Hillary Clinton on the pressures of being a female president. The former First Lady, Secretary Secretary of State and New York State Senator, formally announced her entry into the presidential race of the United States yesterday. Clinton, who lost a primary race to candidate Barack Obama in 2008, promised to be a champion for everyday Americans in 2016. She becomes the first Democratic candidate to formally announce a run for the White House. Clinton has cozied up to such figures as Henry Kissinger and faces predictable contempt from the right, but also strong skepticism from the left. She's been laying the groundwork for yesterday's announcement for months now. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Marco Rubio also just announced his candidacy today. Well, Rahul, we're going to get into in-depth coverage of Clinton's qualifications on this program, but in a nutshell, what's your opinion of a future President Hillary Clinton?
Well, I guess the best thing to say about her is that she's not a Republican, and I do think that it's important to note the difference that's going to make. It's unlikely she's going to try very hard to roll back some of the handful of major achievements domestically of the Obama administration. But it's really a question. She's very much balanced on the one hand between a very neoliberal past, lots of cronies who are very into constantly coming up with new modes of corporate influence, into rhetorical displays of hawkishness and constant sort of overtures towards the right kind of Republicans in her point of view. And on the other hand, the clear recognition, I think it's finally sunk in, that Obama managed to actually build a democratic political machine that works at least to get people elected president. So I think she's trying to play a balancing game with that. I think the balancing game will continue when, as I guess is most likely, she'll be elected. I don't expect that, despite her rhetorical hawkishness, there's going to be very much escalation internationally, but I also don't think there are great prospects for rapprochement with Iran under Hillary Clinton.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Rahul, for joining us today. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Time magazine's cover story this week displayed the slogan Black Lives Matter in bold white letters on a black background. It was accompanied by images of the white South Carolina police officer Michael Slager pointing his gun at a fleeing black man named Walter Scott, whom he shot in the back in cold blood. It is as though mainstream America has finally woken up to the reality of black lives in America and the criminal behavior demonstrated by law enforcement. Video evidence captured on ubiquitous cell phones seemed to have finally confirmed what black people had been saying about police brutality for years, but which political and media elites and the public at large refuse to believe. But the public has also ignored another issue, one which is hard to capture on video, and that is how the epidemic of economic injustice in the black community is also part of the story. African Americans have been hit the hardest by the recession, and unemployment remains far too high. Today, we continue our ongoing coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement and connect it to the all-important issue of employment and economic justice. Joining me in studio are two guests. Melina Abdulla is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and organizer with Black Lives Matter LA, and Loretta Stevens, co-executive director of the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, a project of the UCLA Labor Center. I'd like to welcome both of you to the program.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. So much to talk about. First, let's talk some specifics and then get into generalities and connections between these issues. I want to play an excerpt of the video that was recorded by this young man named Faden Santana of the shooting of Walter Scott by Michael Slager. I want to warn our TV audience here, and this is a point of discussion as well about the sort of desensitization from viewing these videos. And so for our TV audience, if you do not want to watch this video, please turn away or turn off your TV screen for a few seconds. And for our radio audience, you will hear a number of shots. And that is a very brief excerpt of the video captured by Faden Santana of the shooting of Walter Scott. Melina Abdulla, we're being told that this issue, this incident, is different. Time magazine saying this one is different because it was captured on video, so we knew what happened. We knew this cop planted the taser, told a completely different story than what actually happened. But is it really different?
No, it's not very different. I think that the response is a bit different. The immediate firing and charging of the officer who killed Walter Scott is a bit different. But having it on video is not different. We know that Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and even if we go as far back as 2009, the murder of Oscar Grant was on video. And so that hasn't led to the prosecution of officers in the way that needs to happen. It hasn't led to the policy changes that we need to have happen, and it hasn't led to the disruption of the system that systematically targets and kills black people. So if we think about what happened to Walter Scott, just the behavior of that officer, who the media, mass media, has tried to humanize. I mean, I'm very
heard video of his mother.
Right, and it's disgusting, and it's well thought out how they're doing it. He had a little baby on the way, and you know, he's a good person. The way that mass media is doing that is part of this overall system that elevates the lives of white folks, right? Even murderous white folks, and really kind of devalues the lives of black people who were, in this video, it was clear he was hunted as if he were an animal, right?
Loretta, the media has also brought up the fact that Walter Scott owed $80,000 plus in child support that he hadn't paid, and he was worried about being arrested because there was a warrant out for him, and that's why he ran. And of course, he is not here to defend himself, but that's the story that's being told about the victim in this case. And how do you respond to that?
Well, I think the issue of child support is a challenge for black men. I was looking, and the marriage rate for black people was greater than white people, like from the 1890s to the 1960s. Then it changed. Mass incarceration numbers went up, and penalties start getting placed on black people. When you can't make a decent living, how are you supposed to be able to take care of your children? So what I've seen happen is the institutionalization of these outrageous fees that's over your head, that even if you get a job, that how much of your check is taken and given back to the state. So I do think there's issues like that, warrants, Ferguson, all the failures to appear, the excessive tickets. I think that Ferguson report shows a lot of those kind of penalties that black people are subjected to at a high level. So nobody wants to go to jail.
Melina, over the weekend, on Friday actually, an Oklahoma Sheriff's Department released yet another horrific video of a black man named Eric Harris, who was fatally shot by a white reserve deputy. This is someone who sort of pays to be on this force as a reserve deputy. This man named Robert Bates, who apparently meant to shoot his taser, but instead pulled a gun. And while Harris, and of course we we think of Oscar Grant, right? And while Harris was on his stomach dying of gunshot wounds, he said, "I'm losing my breath." Several law enforcement officers bent over him, handcuffing him while he lay dying, and one officer just said, "F your breath."
Right.
And he died very soon after. So again, the word victim was used to describe Robert Bates, a victim of slip-up, that he meant to pull his taser but pulled his gun. We keep victimizing the murderers.
Yeah, and we keep victimizing the murderers and then indicting the actual victims, which are the black people who are killed every 28 hours by law enforcement. And so it's important that we say the names of the murderous police who kill black people. So it's important that we talk about Michael Slager not as a father-to-be, but talk about Walter Scott as the father of 4 actual children, right? It's important that we talk about Eric Harris as the person who was killed and talk about Robert Bates as a murderer who killed them. We know from the Oscar Grant case, right, anyone who has a discerning eye, that it's very, very difficult to mistake a taser for a gun. That the way that things are set up, that's a near impossibility. But you know, they use pretty much anything that they can to give an excuse. I think that if police are so inept as to not be able to control their weapons, so we hear 2 arguments often, that he was going for my gun, or in the case of both Eric Harris's murder and Oscar Grant's murder, I mistook my gun for my taser, right? So if that's the case, maybe police shouldn't have lethal weapons.
And you were mentioning Walter Scott being hunted down like an animal, and that was true for the Eric Harris video as well. They literally chased him, pulled him down. Loretta, let's start right away to make these connections. How important is the connection of economic injustice in the African American community and the interactions between police and African Americans? Because it seems as though police are considering themselves a judge, jury, and often executioner, and a lot of the so-called crimes that people are being chased down for can be linked back to economic injustice.
Right. I think that the black job crisis is just a reflection of how it seeps into the other areas of our lives. The fact is
and how deep is that crisis?
Okay, nationally, the numbers are 10.4% unemployment for blacks, 4.7% for whites, 6.6% for Latino, and 4.7% for Asians. But the thing those statistics don't show is that it's been this way for 50 years. I was outraged to find that since the Bureau of Labor Statistics have been keeping track of the numbers, it hasn't changed. And some of the obstacles you hear, and I do think there's black fear of black men, okay? They're big, they're strong, we're scared of them.
Yeah,
they're animalistic.
The overestimating of the ages of young black boys.
Right,
yeah.
and the same with black boys. There's been studies that they're looked at as older, even when our babies are being killed. And I'm older than you guys, but LA has also a long history before then. 5-year-olds being shot under Daryl Gates. Chokehold deaths. The black people's necks are different. Yet you're shackled. So I'm glad for the cameras. I support police having cameras. I want to be able to judge myself as to what's going on. And I think it's been educational for white America. It's like, blacks, we're whining on this and that. But when you see it in your face, it's like, wait a minute.
And people are treating it like a new crisis, but of course we know this is a very old crisis.
But I did want to say I see a positive development, the diversity coming out in this country. Black Lives Matter. And that's where I think it's an opportunity to make some significant changes to improve the lives of black lives, but not just talk about it, but action. And that's what we're trying to do with the LA Black Workers Center, really make a difference.
And I want to get into that in just a bit. But Melina, there's a bit of a debate among supporters of the movement about people watching watching and playing these horrific videos, while it's important to see the brutality of police on display, many fear that watching them desensitizes us to Black death. What do you think? What is your opinion on that?
I mean, I think it's really important. I think having the video is important. I think that what Mr. Santana did in recording it and then turning the video over to the family was really, really courageous.
Really smart, yeah. This is of the Walter Scott killing.
Right. I do have reservations about the police filming it themselves. So here in Los Angeles, we know that there's a history of dash cams being broken off of the police cars.
Yeah.
Right. We also know that I personally witnessed police taking their body cams off and putting them back on. This was the Pasadena Police Department, which has its own problems. And I think that we need to be really thoughtful about what our proposed solutions are. So, like, the use of body cams is an issue. It shoots from the perspective of the police, right? Who has control over that footage? Most of the time, in most jurisdictions, it's the police who have control over that footage.
Right.
So I think that we need to be careful when we say that this is the solution. I think that we are very imaginative people, and we need to kind of come back and think about how we reimagine public safety. So something that Loretta said about the economic crisis is, you know, something that we need to think about. How do we think about public safety in ways that link up with economic questions? How do we think about public safety in ways that link up with educational questions? What we do know for certain is that when you reallocate money and you shift more of the money into social programming and education and economic programs,
jobs, training,
right, that decreases the level of crime.
And it also reduces our need for police, which is something that's not very popular, of course, among the police. Well, Loretta, tell us about the Black Workers Center. This is in Los Angeles where this program is based, but how did it come about? I mean, you guys are now organizing under this campaign, Black Jobs Matter, in the context of the broader Fight for 15 campaign where people are calling for an increase in the minimum wage. But how did the Los Angeles Black Workers Center come about, and can it be a model for how other cities can address the disparities in unemployment?
Oh, definitely. The mission of the Black Workers Center is to increase access to quality jobs, not just the low-wage jobs that a lot of Black people are pigeonholed in. We also want to reduce employment discrimination. When you look at these 50 years of disparate employment numbers, what is really behind it? It's a bigger issue, and the only thing in common in all those years are Black people are still Black, right? The numbers haven't changed, and we're still Black. But we also want to improve industries that employ Black workers, like home care, minimum wage jobs. So that's why we are involved in the fight for $15 an hour. We have over 30% of Black people that are working and making less than $12 an hour. Okay, we have 20% in LA County that are unemployed. So that's 50% that are underrepresented or, and excluded. So around the issue of wage theft, we're trying to address that also. A lot of employers, they got people on the clock. I went to a wage theft hearing. One immigrant worker was talking about working 7 hours and getting paid for 3. Black people, the issue of exploitation and exclusion are connected, because if Black people were in the workplace, you wouldn't work us for 7 hours and pay us for 3. We're about labor standards. We support unions, so it's strategic to invest in for unions and worker organizations to focus on organizing Black workers. And bottom line, I'm tired. A lot of people are tired of this struggle, the burden of racial discrimination, but we have no choice but to fight. And when we fight, we win, and that's what's happening. The MTA project. Los Angeles is planning to spend $70 billion on public projects, taxpayer dollars. They're going to create 270,000 jobs in the next 30 years. Construction industry, great jobs in terms of pay. They're not low-wage jobs, but we're underrepresented in this industry. We have historically been excluded, so we're trying to work with project labor agreements to make a difference, that there's criteria that the communities impacted, like Crenshaw, going right through the heart of the black community in LA. There was like...
So you're demanding that
we're
jobs...
getting those jobs.
Yeah, right.
Yes, and that'll help.
And that would make sense in the community that's suffering the greatest disproportionate unemployment. That should be the community addressed first. Melina, I want to ask you a little bit about one specific person in particular. We talked about Fade and Santana, who came out with this video, and another man named Ramsey Orta, who videotaped the Eric Garner death, has found himself behind bars. Even though activists have raised money for his bail, he remains behind bars. And there have been stories coming out of Ferguson of activists being targeted simply because they're activists, and people who are trying to speak out being specifically targeted. And on our program last year, we had interviewed a young woman named Jasmine Richards from Pasadena with the Black Lives Matter LA group, and I understand she too was recently incarcerated, held on $90,000 bail. What happened to her?
So Jasmine Richards has been working very closely with Anya Slaughter, the mother of Kendrick McDade, who
was another young black man in Pasadena who was killed a few years ago by police.
19 years old, stalked.
Very close to where I live.
Yeah, and not only shot 8 times, but then run over by the police car. And so Jasmine Richards has been doing a lot of work mobilizing folks in Pasadena, and on the 3-year anniversary of the killing of Kendrick McDade, we had a protest. And we believe that she was targeted. No, we don't just believe. They've said that she was targeted because of the protest. And she was charged with really, really extreme charges. So one was terrorist threats. And she was held on $90,000 bail. It was supposedly a coincidence that she was arrested on the day that she was supposed to submit public testimony on the OIR report, the Office of Independent Review report, that discloses that Pasadena police have been behaving in very murderous and out of policy ways, and they didn't want that on record. So our view is that she was targeted and arrested so that she couldn't submit this public testimony. And we've seen kind of this behavior over and over again. We know that charges have been issued against hundreds of demonstrators in Los Angeles. Initially, those charges were held back, and we believe that they were issued later because they think that the movement has diminished and there won't be as much of an outcry. But when we say that Black Lives Matter, we understand that Black Lives Matter means standing up every time someone black is killed by the state, but it also means standing up for our right to demonstrate and our right to protest, because really the subtext of what's being said is we should be able to kill you with impunity and you better not stand up. And so this is really a period of new lynching, right? So if we think about the anti-lynching era and the work that foremothers like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were doing, you know, this is kind of the same pattern being repeated, that those who are engaging in anti-lynching work, which is what Black Lives Matter work are radicals that need to be put down. And that's basically what's been happening to us, and that's what's happening with Jasmine.
Has she been released?
She has been released. We got the bail reduced, and thanks to crowdsource funding, we were able to raise her bond. She's still being charged under all of those charges, so her first hearing is coming up tomorrow.
Wow.
And then the Black Lives Matter 7 are also being charged. Their first hearing is actually on Wednesday. So the city attorney in Los Angeles has decided to charge the Black Lives Matter 7, who are accused of shutting down a freeway in November, also in an effort, we believe, to put down the movement.
And I should mention that some crowdfunding groups like Indiegogo have now pledged to not allow fundraising for cops involved in killing killing African Americans, which is certainly a heartening move. And actually, on that issue, Loretta, how you mentioned that you were optimistic. The Time magazine cover is taking this movement mainstream. Just a couple of days ago, last week, I was in South Pasadena with some family friends, and I saw a police officer pull over and chase a young Latino boy, run after him in broad daylight, started going for his holster. We all freaked out, and then the boy stopped. He was tackled, handcuffed, and immediately, I came to my senses, pulled out my phone, and there were 3 other people videotaping this incident alongside me, and I just started saying, "We're watching you," and all of them nodded their head in unison and said, "We're watching you." This is a cultural shift here. Are you heartened that police are really on notice now? Not just from the black community, but from everybody?
I am. I mean, I think we forget sometimes who pays our salaries. The police are paid by the public. Their attitude should be they're there to really serve us and not corporations and view black people as criminals. So I do think that the whole issue of jobs and trying to make a difference where the quality of life can be improved despite the 2-tier structures that still exist in this country, and it's not the burden of black people. I think it's the burden of America that we have to take the value and speak up for black lives if they really matter. And I do think that now is the time. People are awakening that there is a major problem in this country, or it's obvious with the police realm of activities, but also let's look at the jobs. How do we really improve the lives of black people? And what I found interesting is that 43% of unemployed African Americans have some college education. They have some college education, and yet they're out of work. And there was a study, just one more statistic, Young Invincibles, and they said that a white high school dropout or a white person with a criminal record has a better job prospect than an African American with a college degree.
Right. And so I'm wondering, Melina, on that issue, should we not be seeing the implicit bias that cops have when they point guns at African Americans as part of the same spectrum of implicit bias that employers have when they look at, when they interview African Americans, when they look at resumes? I mean, we've seen the systemic discrimination. Should these be viewed as part of the same spectrum?
I think they are part of the same spectrum. I have an issue with the term implicit bias, because I think it's actually more than that. I think it's overt racism, and I think we need to call it for what it is. I know that white people are often some white people are more comfortable with the term implicit bias, but this is white supremacist racism, and we need to understand it and be able to call it for what it is. So it is part of the same spectrum. I think that getting black jobs, and Black Lives Matter, just to be clear, is a partner organization with the Black Worker Center, so we work very closely together. We understand the connection between economic questions and the sanctity of black life, protecting the sanctity of black life. Getting black jobs is hugely important, and it doesn't negate the need for overall systemic change, which, when we talk about the disparity in the unemployment rate, we also want to be aspirational and say that we should live in a society where there is no unemployment, where everyone who wants to work should be able to work, where people earn a livable wage and have all of their needs met. We live in a society that's rich enough to do that. We live in a world that is resourceful, and so that means that we have the opportunity to do that, and it's only because of the choices that we make as a society that we're not doing that.
Well, finally, the media does not make the connection between economic injustice in the black community and police brutality targeting African Americans. And Melina, as you were saying, that activists are making these connections on the ground. But the media isn't, and mainstream America still hasn't made those connections, have they?
No, and I think that's why we have to organize. We have to make our voices heard. We have a Do You See Me Now campaign because people, oh, we can't find trained black workers. We don't want to work. All these biases, but we do want to work. We deserve to work, and black work matters. So, but the only way to win is to organize. So we need to organize black workers, and that's what we're doing at the Black Workers Center, and holding public officials accountable that with public monies that it represents the economies of the whole area, not just a few, and that there's information. There should be audits. There's public wage transparency. Where are those monies going? And all communities should benefit for it, and we are for full employment. Everybody wants to work, and I think the public infrastructure is a great way to start in the urban cities and all the communities, and it's strategic.
We'd like to put information of both Black Lives Matter and the Black Workers Center on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, and we'll post it to our website. I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
My guest, Melina Abdulla, is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and an organizer with Black Lives Matter LA. Loretta Stevens is co-executive director of the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, a project of the UCLA Labor Center. This is Uprising. We'll continue our coverage on this theme with my guest, Alice Goffman. She'll be discussing her new book, On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Most of us know the grim statistics of how many people the U.S. imprisons. We have more people behind bars than any other nation on the planet, and we're imprisoning more now than we have done in the past. In the early 1970s, about 1 in every 1,000 Americans was behind bars. Today, it's almost 1 in every 100, and a disproportionate number of them are black men. Continuing from the discussion we just had on the Black Lives Matter movement and how black jobs matter, we turn now to author Alice Goffman, whose new book, On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City, profiles one poor black community in Philadelphia and how its residents have been transformed by over-policing, state violence, and mass incarceration. Having spent years in a Philly neighborhood that she refers to as 6th Street to preserve anonymity, Goffman traces the life of a group of young men and their trials and travails. She now joins me on Skype. Welcome to Uprising, Alice.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, can you first set the stage for us in terms of how you started this project that turned into the book On the Run? How did you happen to find yourself, a person who had grown up in a wealthy white neighborhood, how did you find yourself in a poor black neighborhood of Philadelphia to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was a freshman in college at the University of Pennsylvania, I started working in the campus cafeteria. And from there, the University of Pennsylvania is situated within a historically African-American section of the city. So it's a majority white, wealthy university within a mixed income black neighborhood. So I started working in the cafeteria on campus, and my boss in the cafeteria was an African-American woman in her 60s who lived in the adjacent neighborhood. the following fall, I started tutoring 2 of her grandchildren, and then the cousin of one of her grandchildren came home from juvenile detention, and that was the sort of pivotal moment for me. I started to realize that lots of boys and young men in this neighborhood were sitting in court instead of in class. They were meeting with probation officers instead of with teachers, and they had low-level warrants for technical violations. They were paying court fees. They were going in and out of jail. So then I spent the next 6 years talking to people, getting to know people, living in this neighborhood, and it became my dissertation and then a book.
Now, can you describe 6th Street? It's not actually called that, I understand, but from your description, it could be any sort of small, blighted neighborhood in an urban center in the U.S. with a majority black population.
Yeah, it's 98, 99% black residents, but it's not the poorest neighborhood in the black section of Philadelphia that it sits within. It's not the most crime-ridden. It's a mixed income neighborhood. There are a lot of middle-class families, a lot of people going to work and going to school, but they're going to school as their neighbors are being chased through the streets and the police helicopters are circling overhead, and lots of young people are being hauled off to jail.
Now, in your book, you explain many terms that people use to describe and classify one another, which was an interesting story in and of itself. Terms like dirty versus clean, hot versus cool. Can you explain some of these terms and how they illustrate the divides within the communities themselves?
Yeah, so basically there are so many young people, particularly boys and young men, who are being stopped and searched and who are being arrested, that your legal kind of qualifications becomes this really important thing to know about other people. So in the first year and a half I spent there, I saw the police stop people and search people or run their names, bring people in for questioning or make an arrest every single day just in this 4-block radius. So with that level of policing, it becomes important to know if your neighbor or your friend has a low-level warrant out or might have something on him that would cause the police to take him into custody. So when people ask, well, when you hear that someone got stopped, the first question is often, is he dirty? Meaning, is he going to make it home tonight, or is he going to be seized, not make it home?
And so let's talk about what you mean by the subtitle of your book, Fugitive Life in an American City. Why do people literally feel like fugitives?
Well, I mean, technically, a lot of young people are actually fugitives. There's about 2.3 million people in the U.S. right now with warrants out for their arrest, and these are so we have about 2.5 million people behind bars, another few million arrested every year, but then we have a large number of people who are living with technical violations, probation, parole violations. They've been stopped in a car, they've been caught drinking, they've broken curfew, or they've failed to pay court fees, like we just saw from that very extensive Justice Department report on Ferguson. Or they've failed to make a court date, and then they're issued a bench warrant for their arrest. So if the police stop them and run their name, they will be taken into custody for who knows how long. So these are people who are living with the fear that at any moment, if the police stop them, they will be seized. And in Philadelphia, there's actually a number of special units that are doing this work of rounding up people with warrants. So in Philadelphia, when I was doing this research, and in lots of other cities around the country, the police are operating on an informal quota system. In order to get promoted or to get a bonus, to show productivity, they need to make a certain number of arrest counts or locate and capture a certain number of people with warrants. So they're going to people's homes, they're going to schools, they're going to hospitals, they're stopping and searching Black young men and hauling them in. So that's what fugitive living is. That's the idea.
Now, what sort of impact does that have on a community? Just, I mean, if we even put aside for a second the mental trauma from a community existing and trying to live in this way, even the basic issue of public safety gets impacted. You open your book with the story of a man who was beaten up by another man and the man who was beaten up refused to get medical help because he was so scared that the police would accuse him of violating his probation that he didn't want to go to the hospital and treat his serious injury.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not just young people living with low-level warrants or any kind of warrant. It's also people on probation, on parole, people who have court cases pending.
And this man
people
didn't
on
do
house
anything
arrest.
wrong. He was a victim of a beating.
Right, but he was, if he had gone to the hospital, it would have been clear that he was out past curfew, that he had been in a fight, possibly associating with known criminals. If some of the people who had beaten him were identified. Alex, he was working at his dad's heating and air conditioning repair shop. He was finishing 2 years of parole after a drug case, and he was just determined to finish his parole. So the hospitals in Philadelphia that are serving Black neighborhoods, the police are present and they're there making arrests. So he knew that the hospital was a dangerous place to go, and he was not going to risk his a parole violation and sort of ruining those 2 years that he had worked to stay clean by going to the hospital. So his cousin, who was studying to be a nurse's assistant, came to my apartment and stitched up his jaw and his chin after this very severe beating. And he still doesn't speak the way he used to, and his eyes are not set at quite the same level in his face. But he succeeded in not going back to prison. He avoided the hospital, and he avoided a parole violation. So that's a kind of pretty messed up system if going to the hospital when you're beaten, or when you want to see your baby who's just been born, will put you back in prison. We should be encouraging people to use hospitals, not making them dangerous places.
Now, in our earlier part of our program, we talked about the connection between economic injustice and police brutality in the Black community, and you describe this difference in your book between those who participate in the underground economy, because they've been shut out of the formal economy, and those who are managing to make it in the formal economy. Tell us a little bit more about this divide. Does it fall along gender lines, age lines, and of course, I'm guessing class lines?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the most kind of sad days that I spent doing this research were days watching the young men that I had gotten to know go out and look for work. When Chuck came home from jail after a case that he'd caught in the schoolyard for pushing a kid's face into the snow. He caught this aggravated assault case, and since he was 18, he went to county jail, and he spent all of his senior year in county jail awaiting charges. And, I'm thinking this whole time, none of the guys that I went to high school with who were getting into fights in the schoolyard were arrested were brought up on aggravated assault charges. Like this is what happens to a Black high school student who pushes a kid's face into the snow. Anyway, he comes home, most of the charges are dropped, and then he just starts looking for work. And he spent months and months and months applying to like the lowest paying part-time jobs, jobs that were not going to give him a decent salary, but jobs that were just going to pay something. PetSmart, Kmart, Walmart, gas stations. Not a single employer ever called him back, and he was using my cell phone as the connection. Like he was writing that down on the forms because it was a kind of stable number, and so he would call me and say, "Has anybody called? Has any employer called?" And every day I had to say no. And after about 6 months, he got too desperate and too hungry, and he took some crack to sell on credit from a dealer nearby. And I remember the day that he sat in my kitchen cutting the crack, and he was furious. He was humiliated. He didn't want to be doing it, but he had just no prospects in the labor market. So, yeah.
So you see these kinds of divides in the community, and of course people who are former felons have that against them and have an even harder time finding a job. What about women in the community? You point out that women are more likely to be part of the formal economy. If they're eligible for public assistance, they're more likely to be on it. How do they deal with the men in their lives living as fugitives?
Yeah, back to your earlier point, I guess, in terms of like barriers to employment. I mean, I think that right now we're seeing people who use drugs as we're in this movement of seeing people who use drugs as worthy of support and mental health help, and we're legalizing marijuana in lots of states and municipalities. We're still seeing people who sell drugs as bad, as evil, as the enemy, as people who should be locked up. And I think if we acknowledge the substantial barriers to employment, to the legal labor market that that Black young men with little schooling are facing. We need to see people who are selling hand-to-hand small amounts of drugs as people who we should include in the labor market and help to get jobs, rather than people who we should lock up and throw away the key.
And
So the women, yeah.
Speaking to the women of the community.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, I mean, at first I thought that women were really kind of tangential to this story I was trying to tell about young men living with warrants and on probation and going in and out of jail. You know, women were visiting their sons and brothers and cousins in prison, and they were sending letters, and they were, you know, dealing with the pain of the household breaking up when the man in their lives was taken away. But I started to realize that women are actually kind of much more central to this story of mass incarceration and police violence, because part of what the police are doing to make their stats to round up so many Black young men for arrest is to turn to women to provide information about them. So, like, one former warrant unit officer that I interviewed in Philadelphia said, we might be able to see every man who with a warrant up on the computer, or, you know, use these databases. But when it comes down to it, we always go through the girlfriend, the grandmother, because she knows where he is and she knows what he's done. So I started to pay more attention to what was happening around women in policing, and I was present for a number of late night raids where police come into women's houses looking for men or trying to scare women into providing information about men. Then we did this, and it's very scary. It's kind of like a tornado in the house. Anything that can be, you know, anything on the shelf is on the floor. Glass is broken, china, you know, they rip the cushions out of the couch and throw the drop ceiling down.
They act like thugs.
Yeah, it's a very kind of
I mean, let's not paper over this. The police are acting like violent criminal thugs. This is gang culture.
Well, they're not treating residents like citizens who they are serving, not at all. Anyway, the raids are terrifying, but what the police also do is pressure women to provide information by threatening arrest, like arresting the woman for the man's crimes, or eviction, or loss of child custody. So women come to these interrogation rooms, or their houses are raided, and then they wake up from that and feel like at any moment they will be taken, their kids will be taken, they'll lose their housing benefits if they don't turn in the men that the police are looking for. So this is a policing strategy that is really about turning men and women against each other, and a lot of violence against women that is totally uncounted. We're not counting the number of raids and these threats that the police are making. Mostly they don't actually do them. They don't actually take away the woman's kids, so that threat doesn't get counted anywhere. But this is state violence, and it's against people who are accused of no crimes.
There was a story in Florida recently of a mother who called 911 because her son was having a schizophrenic episode, and it seemed as though this had happened before, and she obviously didn't know who to turn to. And instead of helping the young man and his mother, a young man named Hall, police shot him to death. I mean, then there was dash cam video. You don't see the young man being shot directly, but you do see the officer's gun going off. I mean, this is a child suffering from mental illness, and no Black mother who has this kind of a episode and who sees what has happened in this particular case is ever going to call the cops for help when they hear that story. How does it undermine public safety so deeply?
Yeah, I mean, I think the police are there to arrest you or to beat you or to shoot you. I mean, in the neighborhoods like the one I was in, they're not there to help you. They're not there to mediate disputes. They're not there to provide you with mental health support. There are a number of pilot programs around the country right now that are actually, we have one in Madison, where I live right now, that are teaching police how to identify mental health kind of problems rather than arrest people and provide support. So I think the more we move in that direction, the better. But certainly in Philadelphia, the level of routine police violence that I saw after police had cuffed people and arrested them, was pretty astonishing coming from the neighborhood that I grew up in. So like the first year and a half, I saw the police punch, choke, beat, stomp on, kick young men, strangle young men after they had caught them 14 times. And many times I would visit young men in jail right after they had been taken into custody, and you can just see like faces that are bloody and eyes that are swollen and lips that are swollen. And you know, sometimes people don't even say anything. It's just like clear that this was part of the arrest.
Right.
So this level of violence, I mean, I think, you know, what's exciting is that police violence now has created this nationwide protest movement. We're really starting to think about counting how many acts of police violence are occurring on a regular basis, and to hold police accountable and to figure out alternatives to this kind of violence in policing. So I think that's pretty great.
Well, they're being held accountable in the court of public opinion, but in terms of actual justice in the criminal justice system, it seems as though that has yet to catch up. But I'm wondering, Alice, obviously you spent years working in this particular community in Philadelphia and putting your book together. When the Ferguson protests happened last summer, did you see that suburb of St. Louis that has become the sort of epicenter of the Black Lives Matter movement? Did you see that as a type of 6th Street neighborhood that could be any of these neighborhoods?
Yeah, I sure did. And and in a way, it was very... it was validating to see the level of warrants and the level of violence and the number of court cases that people per family are involved in Ferguson, because it's like, you know, it's not just Philadelphia and it's not just Ferguson. It's, you know, it's around the country. And part of what's been great about the book that I was working on for so long being out is that I get a lot of letters from people in prison. So I get letters from people in prison all over the country, and they say things like, I'm from San Diego, and you know, what you wrote about, it's the same exact thing that's happening in San Diego, or, you know, I'm from Texas. And so just to see, and I think also, just the heightened public awareness around these issues, that it's not just about Ferguson, but that this is happening. Arrest quotas, citation quotas, this level of police brutality. This is the experience of the police and of the criminal justice system in Black America for a lot of Black Americans, particularly who are poor. So I think recognizing that as a nation is just incredibly powerful and important.
And I want to mention that your book, On the Run, really tells that as a story. You changed the names of the young men and the women that you basically lived alongside practically, and the name of the street. But it is a story, and it is sadly a typical story. How did you win the trust of the people that you were working with to share their stories in a book format?
You know, as a white woman, you know, trying to understand, like trying to write about these issues, I mean, I think trust is it's a funny word. You know, what kind of trust is possible in the racial caste system that we have in American life today? I mean, I think I tried my best, and I spent, you know, I think if you're somewhere long enough and you listen and you try not to come with your own prejudices and you try to understand where people are coming from, I mean, the goal of the project was to understand what young people were facing as they came of age, you know, not to pass judgment. So, I think that helped. But some people, you know, there were a lot of different opinions about what I was doing in the neighborhood. And like Chuck's mom, when she got the first royalty check a couple months ago, she called me and said, I never trusted you until I got this royalty check.
So you're donating your royalties to the very people that you...
Yeah, we're splitting it 18 ways. Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you so much, Alice, for joining us today. Best of luck with your book, and we'll post
Thanks so much for having me on. Thank you for covering these issues. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My guest, Alice Goffman, is the author of On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. And Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander and Stan Mizrahi. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising, and I'll see you tomorrow.